In the glass-walled mansion, where laughter was just a mask and arrogance spread like expensive perfume, she walked invisibly. The maid, a blonde with a tired look, was treated like part of the furniture, useful but disposable. The millionaire's wife took pride in belittling her with every gesture, reminding everyone that the woman was nothing more than a shadow. But fate, silent and relentless, was preparing a twist no one dared foresee. For the man who seemed indifferent, accustomed to figures and contracts, hid a dangerous fissure in his eyes, a forbidden attraction to the one the world insisted on despising, and it would be the moment her silence turned to courage that the lives of everyone in that mansion would change forever. That night, before the assembled guests, his wife used the ballroom as a stage for yet another humiliation. Amid forced laughter and knowing glances, she hurled words at the maid that cut deeper than any knife. The room laughed. Everyone laughed, except him. The millionaire kept his face cool, but inside he burned. His eyes met hers for just a second, and in that brief instant, a dangerous truth became clear. It wasn't pity, it wasn't compassion, it was desire. It was forbidden love, born of injustice, fueled by silence. And while his wife believed she was winning once again, she didn't realize she was digging her own abyss, because the heart she despised no longer belonged to her. If this story has captivated you thus far, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. In the immense mansion located in one of the most upscale neighborhoods in the United States, the silence was not peace, but rather arrogance. The marble corridors, crystal chandeliers, and impeccably prepared dinners served not only as a backdrop to luxury, but also as a stage for veiled humiliation. The millionaire's wife reigned like an arrogant queen, always dressed in the finest jewels, surrounded by friends who echoed her razor-sharp laughter. For her, every detail was another opportunity to reaffirm her position, and every glance up and down at the maid was a cruel reminder that worlds existed, separated by invisible walls. The maid, a young blonde with discreet eyes and a weary body, moved like a shadow through the hallways. She carried trays, changed tablecloths, cleaned up after parties that never belonged to her. Invisible to almost everyone, she was remembered only when a mistake, no matter how small, served as reason for yet another humiliation. "You're nothing," her mistress repeated coldly, turning each task into a test of submission. She lowered her head, bit her lip, and continued, sustained by the need to survive. But within her, even in silence, there was a strength that would not be extinguished no matter how many tried to reduce it to nothing. The millionaire, always busy with meetings and contracts, seemed oblivious to this reality. He lived as if the mansion itself were an extended office. His words were numbers, his expressions calculations. When he passed the maid, he saw her as nothing more than a function, a cog in a mechanism that needed to run flawlessly. But there were moments, rare and almost imperceptible, when his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary, as if something within him betrayed him. No one noticed, nor did he seem willing to admit it. In that environment, suffocated by appearances, life followed a predictable cycle. The wife organized lavish dinners to impress friends and business partners. The millionaire maintained his mask of coldness, and the maid hid in the silent routine of someone who could only exist between orders and contempt. But beneath the cold surface, fate was preparing an invisible movement. What had begun as distracted glances would transform into something impossible to ignore. The flame of forbidden passion was already lit, waiting only for the right moment to ignite what seemed immutable. And it would be. Precisely when the wife believed herself to be at the height of her power, humiliating the maid in front of everyone, that the mask would begin to crack. Because in that mansion, made of gold and vanity, the truth would come not through wealth, but through the courage of someone no one expected. Mornings in that house began with the clang of silverware being lined up on the main table, as if each meal were a spectacle. The maid arrived early, setting china plates she would never use, and serving coffee she would never drink. It was part of a ritual that didn't belong to her, but which demanded absolute perfection. And it was precisely in the almost invisible details that her mistress found openings to attack her. A napkin folded at an incorrect angle, a cup slightly off-center, a piece of bread served prematurely. "You never learn, do you? Even simple things seem too much for you." The words were laced with venom, uttered in front of the millionaire who was leafing through his newspaper without raising his head. His silence weighed more heavily than his wife's voice. The maid swallowed the pain like someone swallowing ice water on a fever, with difficulty but without a choice. There was no room for defense. The millionaire remained motionless as if nothing were happening, as if the scene were just a natural part of his routine. But his eyes occasionally flicked up briefly over the edge of the newspaper. He saw. Pretending not to see was his role. One morning, the humiliation went even further. Friends of the wife were present, and the table was more crowded than usual. Amid forced laughter, the employer decided to turn the maid into a spectacle. "Watch this," he said as she served the coffee. "Even putting a simple spoon in the right place makes a mistake. Perhaps we should pay for etiquette lessons even for our own servant." The laughter echoed like stones against glass. The waitress, her hands trembling, stood her ground, silently withdrew and continued serving, her face flushed with embarrassment. The millionaire remained impassive, but something inside him burned. He tapped the spoon against the cup with unnecessary force, momentarily attracting his wife's attention. "Is everything okay, dear?" she asked in a honeyed tone. He merely looked up and replied curtly, "Go on." The room erupted in laughter, but the tension lingered in the air. On another occasion, the wife made a point of belittling the maid in front of her son. "Don't accept anything from her. You don't need the pity of someone who is nothing." The boy with wide, sad eyes looked at the maid as if seeking permission to disobey, and she, with a small, discreet gesture, offered a piece of fruit hidden behind the tray. The boy accepted, smiling with the silent complicity of someone who already understood that true love is measured not in titles, but in actions. With each humiliation, the maid emerged more hurt, but also stronger. She kept the cruel words in her heart, transforming them into invisible scars. She didn't cry in front of others. Her tears belonged on the pillow in a small room, far from the judgmental eyes, and while her employer believed her words erased any chance of dignity, she didn't realize that, in fact, they reinforced the silent admiration that was beginning to grow in the heart of the man beside her. The millionaire on the outside was rock, but on the inside, each attack he witnessed planted seeds he couldn't uproot. Because, deep down, there was something about that young woman's quiet strength that awakened in him a conflict that could neither be bought nor ignored. And this internal battle would only intensify, paving the way for the twist fate had already written. The following days seemed to stretch like rubber bands under the weight of what no one said. The whole house worked like a clockwork, but there was, between two specific gears, a thread of light that insisted on escaping. It began with a chance. Encounter in the library. She went in to dust a row of encyclopedias and found the millionaire standing before the window, the city reflected in the glass like a second horizon. He didn't notice her presence until the dust suspended in the air glinted under the lamp and traced the path of her hands in the space. "Continue," he said, without turning. The word sounded less like an order and more like permission. When he finally looked, the gesture was brief, but it was enough. The gaze that fell on her wasn't that of someone inspecting a job. It was that of someone seeing someone for the first time. The next day, an almost ridiculous detail altered the course of silence. She left a glass of juice on the side table in the office. The couple's son was playing there, and discreetly lined up the pens, a habit of someone who organizes the world so as not to be swallowed by it. As she left, her back burned with the certainty that she was being watched. She turned her face. He followed her with his eyes, as if trying to learn the choreography of her movements. He said nothing, but that evening, as she passed through the kitchen, she found a small thermos and a typed note. "For cold shifts." There was no signature. She recognized the handwriting she hadn't seen. Then began the encounters where chance pretended to be destiny. In the service corridor, where he appeared unexpectedly and held the door open for her to pass through with a basket of clothes. In the side garden, where the shadow of a palm tree outlined the outline of two strangers who had learned to breathe in unison. In the elevator, which froze for a second and made both their hearts hide their shock in the same pause. In all these moments, the rule seemed the same. Avoid words that could be used as proof, but admit in the eyes what could no longer be denied. The maid, who had always measured life by the economy of gestures, began to wear a new kind of care on her face, that of not letting her heart show more than necessary. His wife, Empress of Appearances, still reigned in the main hall, but the air around her had lost a degree of authority. When she raised her voice, the millionaire took a second longer to turn his face. When she ridiculed the employee for trivialities, he responded with a silence that was no longer connivance, but rather disagreement held tightly behind his teeth. One windy afternoon, he caught her in the courtyard struggling with a sheet that insisted on escaping the makeshift clothesline for laundry. The fabric whipped, lightly cutting the skin on the back of her hand. He took a step forward. He stopped halfway, aware of the risk of turning caution into proof. "Leave it," he said, and pulled from his pocket a cotton handkerchief that was too light to be casual. She extended her hand without looking at his, as if accepting help from a stranger to avoid falling while crossing the street. The touch never happened, but the near contact vibrated in the air like a chord. The music cut short before the end. At night, the library returned to neutral territory. A piano slept under a cloth cover. She, wiping the rim, let out a note. The sound spread a clean melancholy, almost of an old church. He appeared at the door, his tie loose, a rare flaw in his armor. He didn't reprimand her. He walked to the piano, lifted the cover, played two notes, a third that begged for a response, and the room acquired the exact dimension of what would never be said there. The silence. That followed was more intimate than any conversation. Before leaving, he pointed to the lamp and said, "Low light so as not to strain your eyes." It was about the piano. She understood it was about her. Small measures began to draw a secret map. The previously cruel schedule gave way to her staying up all night unnecessarily. Access to the internal kitchen was granted with an administrative excuse. Routes through the most hostile corridors became free of obstacles. No one gave her explanations. No one needed to. The housekeeper, an old sentinel, realized before anyone else and chose to remain silent, protecting with her silence that which life so rarely offers to ordinary people: breathing space. One late afternoon, the rain poured a grayness like an old movie over the city. The maid was gathering pillows on the terrace when the wind lifted one of them and threw it into the pool. Not wanting to get completely wet, she leaned over as far as prudence would allow. The millionaire appeared. With a rescue pole, reached for the fabric and pulled it back. "Thank you," she said, and the word, so small, illuminated the space between them like a light bulb in a forgotten attic. He didn't respond. He only stayed a second longer than a boss should by an employee, and then walked away with steps that betrayed his effort to be polite. The forbidden flame, which never asked permission, found fuel in the interstices, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear to keep it out of her eyes, the way he, without thinking, lowered his voice when she was near, as if afraid of breaking her, the almost reverent care with which she cleaned the edge of his office desk, avoiding touching the papers but correcting the sloppy corners as if restoring dignity to an object, and in everything, the silent certainty that a misstep would be a fall, not a dance. The boy, an innocent witness to what the adult world insists on denying, began to serve as an involuntary bridge. One afternoon, he took to his father a crude drawing of three figures holding hands, a tall man, a woman in an apron, and himself between them, smiling with baby teeth. The millionaire purposely put the paper in the wrong folder so no one would find it. But those who live in hiding know all the places where a secret lurks. His wife found it, and with her fingertips pressed the sheet until it marked the paper. The drawing returned to the table with the creases of a warning. That night, the maid found, on the kitchen counter, the same drawing redone, the hands firmer, the colors more vivid. There was no signature, but there was courage. From then on, fate, ever patient, only awaited a stage. All it took was a big party, too much light, loud music, too many people. All it took was a gesture from his wife, the kind she collected like trophies, to transform the humiliation into a spectacle. And above all, a single miscalculated glance from the millionaire was enough for the flame, until then contained, to surface like an undisguised reflection. Because some secrets don't explode, they overflow, and the first overflow would come with champagne, laughter, and expensive dresses, exactly where the truth prefers to make noise. Shall I continue with the next section, when the luxurious party becomes the stage for public humiliation and the rope finally snaps? The evening of the party began with the din of imported cars parading past the mansion's entrance. The garden had become a stage for ostentation, scattered. Lanterns illuminated palm trees and sculptures, while uniformed waiters walked through aisles of guests with crystal trays. The laughter was loud, the conversations hurried, and every detail screamed power. The wife, dressed in bright red, reigned supreme, greeting those present with the pride of someone who believed she commanded not only the party, but also the hearts of those around her. Amidst this spectacle of vanity, the maid moved silently, carrying glasses and serving dishes, almost blending into the shadows. For her, each party was another minefield, a place where any slip-up became ammunition for further humiliation. Her employer knew this, and it was precisely because of this knowledge that she transformed each event into an opportunity to crush her before the most attentive eyes. The millionaire fulfilled his role as host with his usual rigidity, but behind his neutrality, his eyes searched for signs. Every now and then, he would linger a second longer on the discreet figure passing in the background, and this almost imperceptible detail began to be noticed by the most observant. His wife, with the sharp instinct of a woman who thrives on appearances, caught every slightest gesture, and her anger grew with each passing moment. At the height of the party, with the music blaring and the guests gathered in the main hall, the mistress decided to act. She called the maid in front of everyone, asking her to bring a bottle of very expensive wine. The hallway seemed to narrow as she walked through with the tray in her hands. One misstep was all it took, and fate was ready. As she approached the table, the wife discreetly nudged the young woman's elbow, causing a drop of wine to fall onto the white tablecloth. The gesture was minimal, but the scandal was immediate. "Just look," said the wife, raising her voice theatrically. "She makes mistakes even when serving the simplest wine. Imagine when it's something valuable. That's why some people are born to never leave the place they are." Laughter echoed through the room, some complicit, some embarrassed. The maid, her face burning, stood firm, but her teary eyes betrayed her pain. The millionaire, standing beside his wife, closed his fist over his glass. He said nothing, but his eyes turned to the young woman with unusual intensity. His silence was no longer one of indifference, it was one of contained fury. Those who observed closely noticed. One of the guests commented in a whisper, "He looks at her differently." And that whisper spread like wildfire among the tables. His wife, sensing the diverted attention, felt her control slip. To reassert her dominance, she ordered the maid to kneel before everyone to clean the stained tablecloth. The cruel gesture transformed the room into a courtroom. The maid lowered herself in silence, feeling the weight of the gazes on her, but in her eyes there was something new, dignity amidst humiliation. The millionaire took a step forward, as if to stop her, but stopped himself at the last moment. A conflict burned within him, between the social mask and the truth he could no longer deny. The couple's son, the boy, ran into the room at that exact moment. He saw the scene, saw the woman he considered a friend kneeling before everyone, and ran to embrace her. The spontaneous gesture shattered the logic of the party. The entire room fell silent. The wife tried to pull the child back, but the boy resisted, hiding his face against the maid's shoulder. The image was too clear to ignore. Even in the face of wealth and arrogance, the child had chosen the lap of the woman everyone despised. As the last lights of the party dimmed and the luxury cars pulled out of the driveway, the mansion fell into a heavy silence, unlike its usual. It was a silence of restrained shame, of eyes avoiding each other. His wife, still in her red dress, paced furiously through the hallways, her heels echoing like a hammer. She couldn't bear the memory of the scene. Her Son clinging to the maid in front of everyone, the attention diverted, the whispers spreading like wildfire among the guests. Each memory felt like an affront, like proof that her hold on the house was beginning to crumble. In the pantry, the maid washed the tray in silence. Her trembling hands still wet with wine and tears, she insisted on hiding. Her heart burned with pain from the public humiliation, but it also carried a strange flame. The boy's embrace, so spontaneous and genuine, had been a sign that her dignity had not been erased. In that moment she realized she was not alone. Someone, however small, saw who she was. The millionaire, locked in his office, ran his hands through his hair, as if trying to tame his swirling thoughts. The image of his wife raising her voice in the living room, the young woman kneeling and his son running toward him, wouldn't leave his mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt ashamed not of being observed, but of his own silence. He knew he could have interrupted. He knew he should have, but he didn't, and this cowardice ate at him inside. The next morning the house awoke to a strange atmosphere. His wife feigned normalcy, smiling at her friends over the phone as if nothing had happened, but her voice trembled as she tried to justify her son's behavior. "He's still a child, he doesn't understand," she said, as if trying to convince herself more than anyone else. The millionaire, sitting at the table, ignored her conversations, simply observing the scene in silence, his eyes occasionally falling on the empty chair where the boy usually sat. The maid considered quitting. Shame still burned on her skin, and the feeling of being treated as less than human tore at her. But every time she passed the boy, she saw the same expression of trust in him. He followed her through the hallways, made excuses to help her carry small objects, and smiled when he was near her. This innocent affection was the anchor that held her, even when everything around her was pushing her toward the exit. The millionaire began to show signs of restlessness. One afternoon, he appeared in the kitchen for no reason, simply to ask if the boy had slept well. The maid responded simply, and for a moment their eyes met. No more words were spoken, but something pulsed in the air. He saw in her eyes not just pain, but a strength he had never seen in any of the women in his life. Meanwhile, rumors had already spread beyond the mansion's walls. Guests commented on the party episode at dinners and gatherings, some with pity, others with malice. The wife, angered by the repercussions, decided to tighten the noose even further. She began to closely monitor the maid, ordering her to perform unnecessary tasks, creating situations to expose her, trying to extract any sign of weakness from her. But the more I tried to destroy her, the clearer it became that it was the mistress who was losing control. Fate, patiently, prepared the next step. And this time, humiliation in a crowded room wouldn't suffice. What was to come would challenge not only the maid's dignity, but also the perfect facade her wife had built for years. And when the masks began to slip, no one would be prepared for what would be revealed. It was on a sultry summer afternoon that the unexpected happened. The mansion was preparing to welcome another select group of guests, and the atmosphere was tense with the rush of the servants and the rigidity of the mistress, who repeated orders as if commanding an army. The waitress, silent as ever, was crossing the halls with a tray when she heard a dull crack coming from the main staircase. A heavy vase filled with flowers lost its balance in the hand of one of the older employees and tumbled down the steps. The impact scattered shards throughout the lobby and struck the leg of one of the security guards, who fell with a groan of pain. Chaos ensued in seconds. As everyone backed away in fright, the maid was the only one to rush to him. She knelt beside the injured man, pushing the shards away with her bare hands, heedless of the cuts opening in his skin. She ripped part of her apron to make a makeshift bandage and, with surprising calm, applied pressure to the wound until the bleeding began to slow. The security guard, accustomed to being invisible like her, looked at her with silent gratitude. His wife, watching from the top of the stairs, didn't hide her discomfort. "Take him outside. We can't have any scandals in the hall," she said coldly, without even approaching. The millionaire, drawn by the noise, arrived moments later. He found the young woman kneeling, her face sweaty, her fingers stained with blood, but her eyes steady and attentive. For a moment the world seemed to slow down. He didn't just see a worker improvising a bandage. He saw courage, humanity, a greatness that didn't fit within the social norms his wife so fiercely defended. Her image, so small before the imposing marble, yet so immense in dignity, pierced him like a red-hot iron. The other servants watched in silence. Some whispered that they had never seen such bravery. The housekeeper, accustomed to swallowing humiliation in silence, let out a brief, almost complicit smile. His wife, noticing the stairs, walked down the stairs with firm steps and tried to regain control. "That's just the least you'd expect from someone in this position," she said, forcing a smile. But no one believed her. The contradiction was exposed. While she was concerned with the party's appearance, the maid displayed genuine humanity. As the security guard was led away for treatment, the young woman stood slowly, silently wiping her hands. Turning, she found the millionaire's eyes fixed on hers. There was no longer any disguise. In that moment, he wasn't just a boss and she wasn't just an employee. They were two worlds recognizing each other for what they truly valued: courage and truth. The silence between them was more eloquent than any words. The mistress noticed. Her eyes narrowed, catching something she'd previously preferred to deny. Her husband had lingered a few seconds too long looking at the woman, and that small detail, small to anyone, was enough to plant the seed of hatred within her, a hatred that would quickly grow, turning into an obsession. Night fell over the mansion, and the lanterns were lit to welcome the guests as if nothing had happened. But in the hallways, amidst reflections and shadows, everyone knew something had changed. The waitress, her hands still scratched, carried the pain like a trophy. The millionaire in his office couldn't get the scene in the hall out of his mind. And his wife, in her bedroom, silently plotted how she would once and for all crush the woman who threatened his empire of vanity. The following week began to unfold with small detours that no one noticed except the two of them. In the mornings, when the sun streamed through the immense windows and spilled liquid light onto the marble, she passed with the cleaning cart, and for a second, the millionaire slowed his pace just to synchronize their breathing. It wasn't visible, but it was there. Their time slowed when they occupied the same hallway. One Tuesday, the service elevator stopped a floor earlier than expected. The doors opened, and they found themselves face to face, as if the house had decided to officially introduce them. He held the door with the palm of his hand. She entered. Without looking up, the silence between them had the density of a confession. "The cut on your hand, does it still hurt?" he asked, his voice sounding out of place, too human for that glass tower. "It's not bleeding anymore," she said, and the simple phrase carried a metaphor neither of them dared touch. When the elevator started moving again, both of their hearts already knew what their heads were trying to deny. In the afternoon, in the side garden, the wind stirred the magnolias, and she gathered leaves with the care of someone guarding memories. The boy appeared with a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, and without realizing it, placed the paper in his father's pocket. The millionaire folded the sheet as if guarding a jewel. Then he walked to the pantry and with new and trembling courage left a smaller thermos next to the sugar bowl with a typewritten note, "For the cold hours." The housekeeper saw it, but chose to look the other way. In that house, loyalty was sometimes made of silence. Their encounters then learned the art of unexpected events. In the library, where the piano slept under its cloth cover, she lifted the dust cloth and, without meaning to, touched a key. The note ran through the room like a tear. He entered, loosened his tie, played 2 notes that spoke of a childhood without a lap, and, in a gesture no etiquette manual anticipated, pushed the lamp away so the light wouldn't hurt her eyes. "Thank you," she said, and he couldn't tell if her gratitude was for the light, the music, the care, or the fact that someone was finally there whole without numbers. At night, when the boy had nightmares, the governess would send for her. She would sit on the edge of the bed, counting backwards, as if pulling sleep with an invisible string. And when the little boy finally gave in, she would stay for another 5 minutes, as if watching over a miracle. At these times, the millionaire would sometimes appear at the door, leaning against the frame, his face bathed in silence. "He sleeps better when he's present," she would whisper without looking. "Presence," he would repeat, as if testing a new word on his tongue. and he would leave feeling lighter, with the feeling that a simple truth had just dismantled a lifetime of defenses. There was also the coat incident. The air conditioning was relentless, and she, still damp from working outside, shivered. He appeared behind her, held out his own jacket with awkward care, and she almost refused. Rules, always the rules, but accepted it for a minute, just until her skin stopped trembling. The fabric carried a scent of night and responsibility. When she handed it back, folded, their fingers brushed for an instant, and the brief contact seemed to light a light bulb inside. There was nothing scandalous about the gesture, but for those who live by appearances, a small gesture is a whole page. Small measures began to reorganize the hostile layout of the house. Tasks were redistributed. Without fanfare, schedules were less harsh, and the early morning shift was shortened on rainy days. No one signed any memos, but everyone sensed something had shifted. The maid began walking with a millimeter more air in her lungs. The millionaire, with a millimeter less coldness in his gaze. In the pantry, a silent ritual took place. A mug positioned to the left meant rest. To the right, be careful, the weather is unfriendly today. The secret language of those who cannot speak learn to exist on the edges. Still, desire was a boundary. He resisted any word that might turn respect into an excuse. She resisted any gesture that seemed ungrateful to the roof that sheltered her. Tension, however, grew in the opposite direction of prudence. One late afternoon, she was organizing books in her office when she found, among reports, a card with no logo. Not everything worthy needs to be said. She recognized the timbre of his silence. She tucked the card away with a metal button the boy had called a medal of courage, and she decided that if fate wanted to push them to the brink, she wouldn't be the one to take the step. The heart, however, doesn't usually ask permission. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had happened. Inside, the mirrors were already showing other faces. His wife still reigned supreme in the salon, but her authority crumbled in the friction with a dignity that grew where she least expected it. The social circle, the one that sniffs out change like perfume, began to notice that the millionaire lost focus when the maid passed in the background. And whispers are bridges to disaster. A single spark, a calculated error, a staged coincidence, an object out of place, would be enough to turn suspicion into accusation. Fate, patient, was already sharpening the blade for the next scene. The news didn't arrive as news. It arrived like the smell of smoke. The wife's friends began to appear with quick visits and lingering glances, whispering in the garden about certain intimacies that a respectable home should not tolerate. The employer, who smelled danger like someone smelling expensive perfume, understood the message she herself had sent to the wind. It was time to crush. The first blow was silent. She rearranged the schedules, replaced days off, put the maid on routes that forced her to cross her husband's office more often than necessary, and then suggested, with a stinging smile, that the employee was looking for situations. In the hallways, her voice rose a half-tone. Her sentences became longer. Her questions began to carry traps. Where were you at 6:32 p.m.? With whom? Doing what? With each simple answer, the employer invented an insinuation. It was like trying to walk across a polished floor, knowing someone was rooting for you to slip. One morning, the wife decided to turn the cafe into a courtroom. She sat at the head of the table, aligned her sapphire bracelet on the tablecloth, and, as the waitress served, dropped. The phrase with calculated venom. They say the staff on duty confuses kindness with invitation. The guests laughed. The millionaire swallowed hard. The boy lowered his eyes. The waitress held the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white, but she didn't give the show the fall they expected. She finished the service, collected the cups, and disappeared into the pantry like someone putting out a fire from the inside. Only when no one was looking did he lean his forehead against the cold door for 3 seconds. Then he returned to work. Dignity is the last cup spilled. The following nights were filled with small, choreographed acts of cruelty. The mistress left objects in unlikely places and demanded explanations, rephrased orders already carried out to accuse them of disobedience, and planted mistakes where none existed. He began to circulate more frequently around the service floor, as if the staff's territory belonged to him even more than the rest of the house, and each appearance brought a sharp question or a cutting comment. The social circle received the ready-made script. She's ambitious. She takes advantage of the boy. She's confused about her place. These words, repeated in clubs and restaurants, returned to the mansion with the weight of respectable opinion. The millionaire sensed the siege and, at first, tried to untangle the knots with bureaucracy. He asked the housekeeper to centralize routes, requested by email that no one on the team before moved unnecessarily, and created excuses for the young woman to stay in less exposed areas. It was no use. His wife was skilled at turning care into evidence against the caretaker. When he was 2 minutes late leaving the office because the maid passed by with a tray, the boss would suddenly appear staring between them like a hot skewer. When the boy ran to the employee to show her a drawing, his mother would tear off the sheet of paper, crumple it slowly, and return it as a lesson in hierarchy. There was one particularly cruel afternoon. The mistress called the maid into the closet and, surrounded by dresses that cost an annual salary, asked if she had anything to confess. The young woman took a deep breath, saying only that she did her job with honesty and respect. The wife smiled without showing her teeth. Honesty, my dear, is a luxury that can be proven. And she closed the door with a click that sounded like a sentence. That night, the entire house felt a chill that didn't come from the air conditioning. The housekeeper locked the pantry early. The head of security circulated with a notebook. The boy slept with the light on. The millionaire stood before the office window as if trying to see the future in a reflection. The next day things seemed strangely in place, which in that house was always a bad sign. The flowers were changed, the piano tuned, the napkins folded with theatrical perfection. The sapphire bracelet was missing from the coffee table. The wife dressed her most impeccable self, and for hours didn't raise her voice. A trapped silence hung over the hallways. The maid performed her duties with surgical precision, like someone treading on the edges of tiles to avoid breaking the roof. The millionaire entered and left his own office twice without remembering why. I expected a noise, but it didn't come. The invitation came. At 4, everyone in the main hall. The message ran through the radios like a breath of ice. The staff aligned themselves with the posture of those familiar with the liturgy of embarrassment. The boy appeared at the banister. The housekeeper pulled him back in vain. His wife descended one step at a time, slowly, carrying a box of groceries from the pantry, too heavy to be a storyless object. The millionaire beside her seemed made of stone. Inside, the stone cracked. The maid remained where she was, hands clasped in front of her, breathing like someone learning to swim in very cold water. No one spoke. The living room clock struck a full minute of silence before the mistress opened the box and held up something that gleamed in the light like a promise of disaster. The spark was lit. The fuse was running, and an entire house accustomed to applauding wrongdoing was about to witness the first explosion of karma. The main hall resembled a makeshift courtroom. Everyone was there. Servants lined up in silence, the housekeeper with her eyes downcast, security guards as still as statues, and the millionaire standing beside his wife, his face as hard as marble. On the box his mistress held in her hands gleamed the sapphire bracelet that had disappeared days before. The cold gleam of the stones reflected in everyone's eyes like a predetermined verdict. "I found this in the pantry among the groceries," the wife said, her voice carrying a false gravity. She turned slowly to the maid, who remained motionless, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Who else would have access? Who else would have motive? The room fell silent, every gaze weighing on her as if she were already guilty. The young woman tried to speak, but her words came out shaky, barely audible. "I've never touched that. Never." Her mistress laughed humorlessly. "Of course not. It's always like that, isn't it? Too innocent to admit it, but too ambitious to resist." She then turned to her husband, seeking the seal of authority. "In our house, there can be no room for people who confuse trust with opportunity." The millionaire closed his eyes for a moment. His throat felt dry, as if something was strangling him from within. He knew she hadn't stolen anything. Every fiber of his being screamed that certainty. But the weight of appearances, the eyes of so many, the farce his wife had staged in front of everyone. Everything was binding him with invisible chains. When he opened his eyes, it was too late. His silence was the sentence. The boy, who had been watching from the banister until then, ran down the stairs, his bare feet slapping against the marble. He threw himself at the maid, hugging her waist tightly. "She didn't do anything. Don't send her away," he shouted, his childish voice echoing like a blade. The mistress tried to pull him away, but the boy clung even tighter, burying his face in her apron, wet with unshed tears. The housekeeper intervened, her voice breaking. "Madam, perhaps we should—" But her mistress cut her off with a curt gesture. "Enough. This farce has gone on long enough." And with a coldness that chilled everyone, she ordered the guards, "Escort her to the gate." Two men approached, not violently, but with the firmness of someone following orders. The waitress, trembling, knelt before the boy, cupped his face in her hands, and murmured something only he could hear. Courage is remembering how to breathe, even when it seems impossible. She discreetly handed him a small metal button, the medal of courage he had given her days before, and smiled with the dignity of someone who knows that, even after being expelled, she is not defeated. He stood up, lifted his chin, and walked across the room under the weight of all eyes. His wife wore a triumphant smile, but the millionaire, motionless, looked like a statue cracked inside. His eyes followed the young woman's every step to the door, carrying the pain of someone who lost something they never had the courage to hold on to. The iron gate swung open, and the wind from the street rushed in like bitter freedom. The waitress left without looking back, her small purse in her hands and her heart heavy but unbowed. His wife believed she had won, but in truth, that morning, he was signing his own sentence, because the boy cried inconsolably in the housekeeper's arms, and the millionaire, alone before his guests, felt that the silence he had chosen that day would be the ghost that would never leave him in peace again. The mansion resumed its luxurious routine, but it was no longer the same. The marble was as polished as before, the chandeliers sparkled during social dinners, but there was an emptiness that nothing filled. The maid no longer walked the halls, and this silent absence spread like a shadow. The millionaire noticed it in the details no one else saw, the breakfast served with mechanical perfection, but without the care of old. His son's room tidied without that discreet touch that always left a window ajar to let in light. The cold silence of the library, where before a book would appear open to the right page, almost as if by magic. For the first few days he tried to deceive himself. He imagined that time would erase the scars, that routine would swallow him up again. But the memory of the scene at the gate, the boy clinging to her lap, the young woman's firm gaze even in the face of expulsion, became increasingly unbearable. The weight of his silence that morning corroded him like rust. He could have spoken. He could have defended her. He didn't speak. He didn't defend her. And this sin of omission was crueler than any accusation. The son, in turn, changed. He stopped smiling often, avoided his mother, and sought refuge in his room, hugging a rag doll he once shared with the maid for playtime. Hired caregivers came and went, none of whom lasted more than a few days. The boy refused food, screamed in nightmares, and cried for her. "I want the medal of courage," he would say. His impatient wife saw this as mere tantrums. But the millionaire saw the truth. The boy didn't just want the medal. He wanted the presence that taught him that courage is also about breathing. In business meetings, the millionaire began to lose focus. Faced with spreadsheets and million-dollar contracts, his mind wandered to the image of her kneeling in the living room, to the sound of her calm voice as she soothed her son. At night, he would stand on the balcony, looking out at the empty garden, hearing only the distant hum of the city. Silence, once comfortable, now weighed like chains. His wife, on the other hand, believed she had restored order. She resumed partying, reappeared in society columns, and laughed loudly at dinners to show she remained in control. But what I didn't realize was that every laugh sounded more forced. Every comment sounded like a hollow echo. The guests heard her, but they no longer believed her, because everyone remembered the scene of the boy running to the maid in front of everyone, and that image wouldn't fade. The millionaire tried to fill the void with cold gestures. He gave his son expensive toys, took him on outings that sparked no joy. But deep down, he knew. That wasn't what he needed. He needed her. He needed the simplicity of a firm hand, the silent tenderness that couldn't be bought. One night, alone in his office, he found the drawing his son had made weeks earlier, 3 figures holding hands, him, the boy, and the maid. The paper was crumpled, but the colors were still vibrant. He stared at it for long minutes, his heart aching until he murmured quietly, "I messed up." It was the first time he allowed himself to admit in words what he already knew deep down. The emptiness wasn't just absence, it was condemnation. It was karma collecting the debt of silence. And with each passing day, the millionaire felt more strongly that if he didn't do something, he would lose not only the woman he'd driven away, but also his son's respect and, perhaps, his very soul. On. His third sleepless night he drove alone, driverless, leaving behind the gate that had always closed as a promise of protection. He drove aimlessly along long avenues until he entered a corner cafe, where the city spoke softly. It was there that he accidentally overheard her name on the lips of 2 women. The boss spread the word that the girl was a thief, that she seduced her husband, that she's dangerous around the child. The coffee turned sour on his tongue. It wasn't just his fault. There was poison afoot. He returned to the mansion with his stomach in knots and his mind already made up. He wouldn't live through that night. He called the security chief unannounced. He requested access to everything: safe opening logs, circulation schedules, pantry recordings, shift change reports. He didn't raise his voice, but his coldness was enough. The room darkened. Against the wall, an empty hallway. Then the pantry light flickering on by itself. A gloved hand appearing at the edge of the painting. The sapphire bracelet reaching into a box of groceries. A huge ring glinting on the knuckle, the same one the entire town knew. His face wasn't visible, but there was no need to be. Copies, 2. One with you, one with legal. And a third outside the house, he said, returning to the silence the weight of a truth no longer hidden. As dawn began to show its first blues, he called the housekeeper. He didn't ask, he requested, the boarding house's address. She hesitated only long enough to keep her conscience from bleeding, then wrote it down on a piece of paper. On the way, he stopped at a post office and prepared 3 envelopes. In the first, 3 months' rent receipts. In the second, a simple card. Your name will be cleared. In the third, a copy of a letter of recommendation he had just written. No letterhead, just handwriting. Reliable, courageous, essential wherever you are. At the boarding house's reception, he left the envelopes with the discretion of someone, learning to notice without making a fuss. The next morning brought bureaucracy turned into justice. She filed a claim with her jewelry insurance company and, as a matter of routine, requested an external audit. She copied lawyers and scheduled a procedural meeting with the internal team. At the same time, she called a hotel manager in Brickell, a longtime partner in events, and asked for a quiet interview for a position she trusted. She enclosed, in addition to her own letter, a succinct opinion from a pediatrician, correct intervention in an acute situation, cool-headed and technical. At 11 o'clock, she received the answer she needed. Interview tomorrow, 9 a.m. His son entered the office mid-afternoon, dragging the repaired plastic boat. She said, "Courage is remembering how to breathe," he murmured. The millionaire felt his chest tighten, as if the phrase were engraved within. He sat the boy on his lap and promised, for the first time, swimming lessons, not for luxury, but for life. That same day he signed the donation for the foundation to fund free first aid and child rescue courses in public schools. The city would see philanthropy. He knew it was a plea for forgiveness translated into action. At the end of the day, he called the legal team together. He didn't ask for advice, he gave instructions. That the audit be completed without leaks, that the images be preserved in an external safe, that the report be sent first to the insurance company, then to the advisors, and finally to the press if necessary. The word defamation appeared timidly on the table and grew. His wife, accustomed to turning rumor into judgment, would begin to experience the silence that condemns when the facts finally speak. That night, She parked 2 blocks from the boarding house and remained inside her car, staring at the facade, daring not to get out. She saw a window light up, a figure cross, the outline of a simple life breathing despite the world. She wanted to knock. "Say, forgive me. I saw it late. I'm fixing it." She didn't knock. She stored her words like one storing gunpowder. She knew they needed to explode at the right time, in the right place, in front of the one who humiliated her. Returning home, he found his wife standing in front of the suite's largest mirror, practicing a smile for a weekend event. "The insurance audit is tomorrow," he said, as if commenting on the weather. The sentence fell to the floor like metal. She pretended not to hear. He turned off the closet light as he left. In the hallway, the housekeeper was waiting with a transparent folder. Inside was a drawing of the boy, 3 figures holding hands, and a metal button tied to a string. "Medal of Courage." "He asked you to keep it," she said. The millionaire nodded and for the first time in a long time felt worthy of such a small thing. Dawn arrived with a wind. In his office, he left 3 objects on the desk, side by side: the little boat, the medal, and the letter. Without a letterhead, the whole world might call them nothing. To him they were the map. On the other side of the city she might be sleeping. In the middle, between a heart that had learned to see and another that had learned to resist, truth sharpened its blade. When it cut, there would be no noise. There would be justice. The day of the audit arrived, shrouded in uncomfortable silence. The mansion, accustomed to glitter and parties, now felt like a stage for tension. The millionaire descended. The stairs with a grim expression, while his wife, impeccable in her blue silk dress, smiled at the guests who weren't there, but at herself, as if she still believed she could control the scene. The insurance company auditor was received in the hall with all due formality. He carried a sealed black briefcase that held more than documents. It held truths. He sat at the dining table, which had been converted into a meeting table, and projected the footage obtained from the security system onto the wall. The entire hall fell silent as the image revealed the illuminated pantry, the emptiness, and then a gloved hand placing the bracelet among the boxes of groceries. It wasn't the face that appeared, but the ring, that unmistakable ring that all the wife's friends knew, that appeared in magazine photos and society columns. The hall gasped, as if a secret had been revealed over a loudspeaker. His wife tried to maintain her composure, but the color in her face betrayed her despair. She forced a smile and said, "There must be a mistake, or perhaps manipulation." But her voice sounded fragile, lacking the authority that always accompanied it. The millionaire didn't respond. He simply crossed his arms, looking at her with the coldness of someone who no longer needed proof. The housekeeper, standing in the corner of the room, closed her eyes as if in prayer. The servants, gathered in silence, exchanged discreet glances. There was no need to comment. Everyone knew the truth had finally found its way. Outside, in the social circles his wife so cherished, rumors were already spreading. Invitations were cancelled, dates were called off, messages were responded to with emojis, and then silence. Those who had once laughed alongside her now distanced themselves, as if fearing the fall would be contagious. Her reputation, built on jewels and appearances, was beginning to crumble like cracked glass. Meanwhile, in Brickell, the maid was taking her first steps into a new life. The hotel. Where she now worked was simple, but it held something the mansion had never given her: respect. Colleagues greeted her, guests thanked her for her gestures, and the manager watched her with admiration. One afternoon, a guest fell ill in the lobby. While everyone despaired, she was the one who stepped forward, applying the first aid technique she had learned years ago and renewed in the anonymously paid course. She saved that man's life, as she had saved the boy's before. And this time, there was no humiliation, just discreet applause and recognition. The millionaire received news of this incident from his manager, who sent him a thank you message. He read it and closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare smile. For the first time, he didn't feel embarrassed by his omission, but hopeful for the future. That night he called a meeting with advisors, lawyers, and the head of security. He didn't use harsh words or long speeches. He simply replayed the video, letting the facts speak for themselves. At the end, he simply said, "In this house from now on, proof replaces hearsay." He got up and left, leaving behind the silence of an empire of appearances that was beginning to crumble. The wife remained seated, motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing. The employees left in silence, but there was a new lightness in their steps. The boy, hearing the noise of the meeting ending, ran to his father with the plastic boat in his hand. "She said courage is breathing when you're scared," he repeated. The millionaire took the object, held it tightly, and realized that fate was preparing the outcome. The final adjustment would not be made in secret, but in front of everyone. The wife's mask was already cracked. The next act would be to see her fall in public, under the same spotlight she so desperately sought. And on this stage, karma would insist on taking center stage. The charity ball filled the hall like a sea of light, chandeliers lit, silver polished, photographers circling like satellites. His wife arrived first, dressed to win, ring and bracelet sparkling in a choreography of power she knew by heart. The millionaire came next, sober, his gaze like glass. She tried to link her arm through his, but their skin wouldn't settle. The orchestra launched into elegant jazz, and for a few minutes the city believed everything was business as usual. It wasn't. When the host was called to the stage, he walked slowly, the little plastic boat in his jacket pocket, acting as a weight and compass. He spoke about the foundation, about children, about what money can and can never achieve. The audience murmured affirmations, satisfied with the liturgy. It was then that he took a deep breath, changed his tone, and without any particular effect said, "There are truths that accumulate in silence until speaking ceases to be an option and becomes dignity. In this city, a woman was humiliated, accused, and expelled. Today, before everyone, I say, she is innocent." The audience lifted its chin as if slapped. "The evidence is with the insurance company and legal department. The bracelet was never stolen. It was planted. No name was given. There was no need." The official camera projected a seconds-long clip onto the screen at the request of the auditor present. The pantry, the gloved hand, the unmistakable ring. The sound of the orchestra hung in the air. His wife, seated at the central table, touched her fingers to her necklace as if gasping for air. "Set up," he tried to say, but the words stumbled on the piano notes and fell before the end. Two friends stood up to feign support and halfway through remembered an urgent appointment in another room. The table emptied inches. The power, which had always resided in the eyes, began to shift. He took the small boat from his pocket and held it up to the light. "This reminds me of the day my son nearly drowned in our own appearances. A woman you learned to ignore dove in without asking anyone and brought him back. Her name was soiled by lies. Today I cleanse what I allowed to be soiled." There was iron in his voice, and beneath it, a plea for forgiveness that only those who love can hear. Applause rose timidly, grew, and reached the walls. The orchestra, without a conductor, rested its bows. Behind the room, wearing a simple apron borrowed from the hotel staff, she tried to hide among the sideboards. Her face didn't demand focus, it demanded an exit. The manager whispered in her ear, "Breathe. It's you." The young woman took 2 steps and the world opened up. There was no catwalk, but her eyes formed a corridor. She stopped a few meters from the stage, her hands clasped together, her chest struggling for calm. He saw her and, without etiquette, descended the steps as if descending from a throne that never belonged to him. They stood face to face, the entire city watching. "Sorry," he said softly, but the microphone picked it up. It was simple, it was clear, it was irreversible. The wife stood, pulled out her chair with a knife-like sound, and crossed the room to regain her territory. On the way, the sapphire bracelet snagged on the table's tulle and bounced, ricocheting into a champagne flute. The thin clink cut through the room like a sentence. Someone refrained from picking it up. The object that had started the farce now floated in a golden liquid, ownerless, without glamour, a perfect metaphor for an empire crumbling under its own power. She stopped, looked around, and realized there was no longer an audience. Her chin, so trained upward, found no place to rest. She took a step back, then another. The boy broke through the adult barrier and ran, like a small meteor, to the woman he called home. He clung to her waist, and for a moment the noise of the hall disappeared. He lifted the medal of courage attached to a string and placed it around the young woman's neck with the solemnity of an ancient knight. The father, empty-handed, understood that this was the gesture that presidents and councils cannot sign. The orchestra, without planning, found 3 notes that fell like a blessing. "Come back to our home," one might have expected him to say. He didn't. "Go back to being who you are, wherever you choose." The audience heard freedom. She heard respect. "I don't need the mansion," she replied firmly. "I need my name." He nodded. "Your name is yours." The hotel manager appeared with a discreet envelope. A promotion, a more dignified shift, an official letter of recognition. The city saw justice written on paper. She felt justice written on her skin. The wife, now a shadow on the edge of the light, tried to salvage the narrative. "I did it for the family's good." The insurance company's lawyer cleared his throat over an open microphone. "The facts don't confirm it." The statement was bureaucratic, but it went down in history like a hammer. There was no public expulsion or speech of revenge. There was only what hurts most for those who thrive. On applause, the collective silence that organizes to look elsewhere. On the terrace, a late wind brought the scent of the sea. The millionaire leaned against the railing and, for the first time in years, breathed without debt. The young woman stood beside him, untouched. The boy held out his hands, one to each, and the 3 of them gazed at the city as if learning a new language. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a real beginning. She would return to the hotel that night. He would return to the house that would now have to relearn how to be a home, and his wife would return to a mirror too large for her to fit alone. But before each of them moved on, there was the moment the camera can't capture, the gaze that gives back to someone what the world tried to take away. When they left the room, the bracelet was still swimming in the champagne, a luxurious little fish in a shallow aquarium. A waiter quietly asked if they should remove it. "Leave it," said the manager. "Some objects need to learn to sink." Outside, the city didn't applaud, didn't boo. It carried on as it always does. Karma, discreet, had already done its work. Those who humiliated were humiliated. Those who slandered choked on their own lies. Those who were invisible shone unintentionally. And the rest, what life doesn't solve overnight, time will take care of. Because time, when it finds courage, turns justice into action. If this story touched you, leave a like so more people can learn about this thrilling twist. Subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more stories of forbidden love, silent pain, and endings only fate can write.